Good morning. I'm Jeff Cleaver, the Executive Director of the Business Healthcare Group. On behalf of BHCG and the Alliance, I want to thank all attendees this morning. We have approximately 370 individuals who registered for the webinar this morning. For attending this timely and critically important event. We're in the midst of a massive effort in this country to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible to mitigate the spread and the consequences of COVID-19. All stakeholders play a critical role in this endeavor and rollout. This webinar is designed to provide the information stakeholders need to make informed decisions and formulate strategies and plans of action to handle vaccinations, given the multitude of policy, cultural, and communication issues they must consider. I know we all have a number of questions and concerns surrounding vaccination efforts. Fortunately, this morning you will get an update on the status of the vaccination rollout in Wisconsin, including the priority of groups to receive the vaccination, as well as practical insights into the legal considerations regarding requiring vaccinations. You'll also hear how employers are addressing these issues and hopefully come away with practical strategies you can deploy to guide employees through these uncertain times so we can help strengthen widespread vaccination adoption. This morning's agenda includes panelists who are medical and public health professionals, a labor and employment attorney, a representative from a major BHCG employer, and a health system medical director and leader. Our first presenters are Dr. John Mayman, Chief Medical Officer and State Epidemiologist for Environmental and Occupational Health with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services, and Stephanie Schauer, PhD, who is the program manager with the Wisconsin Division of Public Health. Next, we will hear from Lindsay Davis, who is a partner with Quarles and Brady in its Labor and Employment Practices group, and then get an employer's perspective from Jim Sharan, who is the Director of the Corporate Benefits with Molson Coors. And then Dr. Margaret Hennessy, Ascension Medical Group's Medical Director, will give us her insights about her role as a physician leader on Ascension Wisconsin's Medical Group's COVID-19 vaccination operational planning team. This morning's program will then conclude with the Alliance CEO, Cheryl DeMars, moderating your questions and providing closing comments. There are just a few housekeeping items I would like to go over before we start. This webinar is being recorded. Also, because this is a webinar platform, all participants have been muted. However, there is a Q&A feature on your screen you can use to submit questions you want to have answered during today's session. We will address submitted questions after the last presenter. Before we begin this morning's program, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we are deeply indebted to our public health workers, frontline medical personnel, and first responders who have been working tirelessly to keep us safe and render care. We are truly all in this together, and I'm sure you agree it is absolutely critical we work collaboratively to support the work of these essential personnel. And now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Mayman and Stephanie. Thank you.
It's Stephanie, if you want to go ahead and get us started, I think you probably have control of the screen.
working on it. It's a little bit of a delay. Perhaps Jolene can help and advance the slide for us. John, it has switched for me.
Okay. Yeah, Jolene, if you're available, I'm not sure who has control, if it's you or Stephanie.
So right now, Stephanie has control, but did you wish for me to advance or just transfer control over to you?
Stephanie, if you're having trouble, I can just click through for you. If you can transfer it over to me. Yeah, sounds
Okay,
good.
sounds great. Okay, you should have control.
Good. Okay. All right. I think it's working for me now. So yeah, again, thank you to Jeff for inviting us both on today. So he already did a brief introduction, so we'll jump into it. But the kind of two things we wanted to focus on today, Stephanie Schauer will start off first, just talking about some vaccine updates, and then based on kind of some of the conversation we had in the planning for this, I'm going to, in kind of the part two of this, talk through some of the kind of practical considerations that employers can consider as we move into this phase of widespread vaccination. So with that brief intro, I'll go ahead and turn it on over to you, Stephanie. You just kind of let me know when you want to advance.
All right, thank you so much. Sorry about that. All right, next slide, please. And just want to take the opportunity to say thank you for the opportunity to present to you and your interest in this topic. It is a bit of a hot topic, and we're glad to be able to provide information at this time. So just to level set that and make sure everybody's on the same page, is there are two currently vaccines which have received the emergency use authorization, and that is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as well as the Moderna vaccine. Both of these are mRNA vaccines, which I'll go to a little bit later about that technology. And both of these doses, or both of these series, require 2 doses for full protection. And the amount of time between the doses does vary depending on which vaccine that you receive. So for Pfizer, it is 21 days, and for Moderna, it is 28 days. It's important to note that you want to keep these are the minimum intervals between the doses. If it goes a little bit longer, that's fine. You don't want to have it spread out too far, but a couple of days a week, it certainly is fine. And CDC has said that certainly there's data to support that doses separated by less than 42 days is acceptable. But when we're thinking about vaccination, keeping closer to these intervals is important, because that's when you'll have the full protection and the benefit of the 2 doses. Next slide, please. So this last slide that I presented is probably going to be outdated in a couple of days, because there is another vaccine that is currently going to be reviewed. Johnson & Johnson, or the Janssen, has submitted an application for their vaccine for the emergency use authorization consideration, and that will be reviewed starting tomorrow. The nice thing about this particular vaccine is that only a single dose is needed, and so it really takes a lot of the logistics out of the mix when you have to think about scheduling not only vaccination efforts for one clinic, but then needing to come back, excuse me, in the needed 3 or 4 weeks for that second dose. If authorized, this vaccine could be available as early March. What we have heard is that initially the number of doses will be limited, but it will be ramping up. And that is really the case that we've seen with many of the vaccine stories, is that the number of doses are limited, but we do hope that they will increase, but keeping in mind that this is a federal resource, that Wisconsin as a state receives an allocation from the federal government on a weekly basis. It typically has been about 70 to 80,000 doses a week. We are starting to see that slowly creep up. Next slide, please.
Getting a little delay as well here.
Okay, there we go. So what are mRNA vaccines? Because this is a little bit different technology than some of the vaccines that we have had in use. And so what it is they carry some of the genetic material that teaches our cells how to make a harmless piece of that spike protein, which is so necessary for this virus to actually infect human cells. And this is what's found on the surface of the COVID-19 vaccine. The cells will go ahead and display this piece of the spike protein on their surface. And this is what triggers that immune response in our bodies is the body recognizes that this is something that is foreign and that we need to go ahead and protect against. And part of that protection includes the generation of antibodies that help us protection. Now, immunity takes into effect many different components of the immune system. Antibodies are just one, but it is certainly a main piece. And this antibody is what helps prevent if we get infected and prevent the further spread and actual results in the infection. Next slide, please. I think some of the questions about the mRNA vaccines are about, well, what happens with that genetic material from the vaccine? And it is destroyed by the cells once the copies of that spike protein are made and it's no longer needed. It is, labile. It does not affect the DNA and it does not enter the cell nucleus. That mRNA does not enter that nucleus. And one of the reasons why we've seen the vaccines come through in a quicker manner is that the mRNA vaccines are faster to produce than some of the older technologies. That's one of the reasons why we have vaccines ready so quickly. Another is that they were actually being produced prior to authorization in the hopes that they would actually be approved for use. And so once they were approved, you saw very quickly that we had vaccine being made. That often is not what is usually employed. It's usually takes some time after authorization or after approval for an entity to ramp up. And in these instances that they actually had made a number of doses, and why you see a vaccine coming out so quickly after authorization. But once again, the technology to go ahead and create these is quicker as well. Next slide, please. So, what are the side effects that folks can expect from the vaccines? It's important to note that people may experience side effects, and some of those more common ones are fever or chills, the body aches, and soreness at the injection site. And it's important that folks understand that this is normal, and it's a sign that you're actually building protection to the virus. So I think as folks go to get vaccinated, that they recognize that this is an expected part. If you're not aware, you might be a little bit caught on a sort of be concerned, but knowing that these are some of the common side effects, they tend to be self-limiting and go away in a couple of days, and it really is showing that you're mounting a response, and that the likelihood of a severe side effect is quite small. Now, I think it is important to note that some individuals are reporting more side effects after the second dose, or if they've had the COVID-19 disease and feeling those more so that they may not feel great for a day or two and may need or wish to call in or not be able to work. And I think this is important from the employer side that you recognize this. Some entities have taken the approach of doing perhaps half their workforce so that they don't have everyone or a large percentage of people out and not feeling well the day after if your clinic is sort of happening during work time or anticipating. I think that also is something to consider as vaccine availability may actually sort of help in this respect, in that the amount of vaccine may not be enough to do the entire group all at once. It depends on the size of the group. It depends on how much vaccine that we are receiving at that particular time. And so you may have folks that are vaccinated on one day at one clinic and then the other half at a subsequent clinic. And that way you can have some staggering if folks are feeling unwell after vaccination. But once again, it should only last for a day or two. And you know, if you have had an outbreak of COVID disease, this is something I think to certainly consider. Next slide, please. We've talked about the emergency use authorization, and this is different than licensure, but I just want to make sure that people really understand what this all entails. Now, this vaccine approval is driven by science. There's no doubt about it. And that the vaccines are going through all of the same steps in the trial phases that all vaccines go through for the full licensure. Now, what the EUA is allowing us to do is use the vaccine while we are still gaining some additional information, but they feel that the risks and the benefits greatly outweigh some of the unknowns. It's important to note that these vaccines were tested in large clinical trials to make sure they met both safety as well as efficacy standards, and that thousands of people of different ages, races, ethnicities, and medical conditions were participating in these trials. So they were very mindful of making sure that they had a group that really reflected more of the American public and not so much the sort of a very standard one type of individual. And then I think also it's important to note that vaccines continue to be monitored through a variety of different systems. Even a vaccine that is fully licensed continues to be monitored, and particularly these for the emergency use authorization, they continue to get data and update, and as we see changes or gain more information, the changes around the vaccine or recommendations around the vaccine may continue to reflect that data. So it's important to note that just because they've received the authorization, that the work continues, the data is still studied, and they are still being evaluated for safety and efficacy. Next slide, please. So there's a number of different systems in place that are looking and tracking the safety of the vaccines, and some of them have been around for a very long time, such as the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System and the others that are listed here. There is a new smartphone-based app called vSafe that once folks are vaccinated, they can opt in, and they can report any secondary effects or adverse events. They're not feeling well or they had a fever, and they can report that in, and that data is actually used and is being monitored to see if what the vaccines are doing. And there have been already some initial publications with that data. Next slide, please. And I will say it is reassuring that what they're seeing in the clinical trials is what we are seeing in use today. So I'm going to switch over to the eligible groups because I know that that's a hot topic. So next slide, please. So here in Wisconsin, as the vaccines were first licensed in mid-December, the first groups to receive vaccine were frontline healthcare personnel. So those were individuals who provided direct patient care to patients who could transmit SARS-CoV-2. As well as residents and staff in skilled nursing and long-term care facilities. In mid-January, we moved to police and fire and correctional staff, and then in late January, adults age 65 and older. The next group that will become eligible starting on March 1st is this group here in the middle, and I will be talking about that in a little bit more detail on the next slides. But you can see that this certainly includes a lot of essential personnel, essential workers, and this is where I think folks are most interested with this call. But recognize that it is not all workers. There's many different ways that if you look at ACIP or CISA makes recommendations for very broad categories. These are the groups that were recommended by the State Disaster Medical Advisory Committee and accepted by the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. And so in Wisconsin, these are the groups that will become eligible. And you can see that there is still some work to be done for individuals or groups that are not in these currently eligible groups to be determined. So other essential workers, individuals with high-risk medical conditions, and the general public still need to have some sequencing done. Next slide, please. So I'll go through these quickly. So the first group is educators in childcare. So this is all staff in regulated childcare, public and private school programs, including out-of-school time programs, virtual learning support, and community learning centers. It also includes, staff at Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs, as well as staff in preschool and Head Start through K through 12 education or settings. And then lastly, faculty and staff in higher education settings who have direct student contact. Next slide, please. It also includes 911 operators, as well as individuals in utility and communications infrastructure. It's important to note that this should be really focused on workers who cannot socially distance and are responsible for some of those fundamental processes and facilities that sort of keep us all going: electric, natural gas, steam, et cetera. And so as listed here. Next slide, please. When it comes to public transit, so this is for drivers who have frequent close contact with members of the public, and it's limited to the public and intercity, commercial intercity bus transportation services, it's municipal public transit services, as well as those who are employed by specialized transit services for seniors, disabled persons, and low-income persons. So thinking about those sort of smaller vehicles that help get these folks to and from appointments, for example. Next slide, please. Food supply chain. So this is a bigger sort of group. So this includes agricultural production workers like farm owners and farm employees. It also includes critical workers who provide that on-site support for multiple agricultural operations. So whether it's livestock breeding, farm labor contractors, crop support, as well as livestock veterinarians. In addition, it includes food production workers like dairy plant employees, fruit and vegetable processing, and animal slaughtering and processing employees. Next slide, please. In addition, in this group, it includes retail food workers like employees at grocery stores, convenience stores, and gas stations that also sell groceries, as well as hunger relief personnel. So those who are involved in the charitable food distribution, community food and housing providers, those that are social service employees that are involved in food distribution, and emergency relief workers. Next slide, please. And then when we move towards essential healthcare personnel, so these are the non-frontline individuals who were not already included. And so these are personnel who are not involved in the direct patient care, but they're essential for that healthcare system infrastructure. So often these are associated with hospitals, but don't need to be. And some categories could include public health, emergency management, cybersecurity, as well as healthcare critical supply chain functions, including the production, manufacturing, and distribution of vaccine, as well as support roles. And it's important to note that it's really thinking about individuals who they may not be involved in direct patient care, but are sort of involved in working and perhaps not able to work from home. Next slide, please. And then lastly, it is staff and residents of congregate living facilities. So this includes a whole host of different groups. We've vaccinated many in skilled nursing and assisted living, and this is broadening it out to other congregate living settings. And in particular, there's settings in this group that may be non-voluntary or provide services to marginalized populations, and really meaning that these residents don't have resources or choices to mitigate exposure. And so really making sure that we're able to protect both staff and residents in those settings. Next slide, please. So in terms of prioritization, vaccine providers are strongly encouraged to continue vaccinating the currently eligible populations. So this includes those individuals 65 and older, and the unaffiliated direct patient care healthcare providers, for example. For the March 1st eligible groups that I've talked about, educators and childcare staff are going to be the priority to begin with. And it's important to note that it is going to take time to get to vaccinating everyone in those newly eligible groups. That is a sizable group, and it does depend on our vaccine supply from the federal government. It has taken us a while to get through the first phase, a number of weeks to go ahead, and the group, as I said, is probably of a similar size that we have. So March 1st, vaccine isn't going to be available for every single individual in the group, but it's important to note that it will be coming, and as vaccine increases, we'll be able to continue marching through these groups. But we are continuing to use every dose that is allocated to Wisconsin and make it available for the currently eligible groups. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, it looks like I'm a little out of sequence. So this is just a quick rundown of what the congregate living facility, so includes the shelters, that transitional housing, and then incarcerated individuals. Next slide, please. Okay. So come March 1st, the vaccination of these groups that I've talked about is going to be supported by a number of different partners on here, including local and tribal health, pharmacy, hospitals, employers, community or commercial vaccinators, as well as some state and federal assistance in the form of community-based vaccination clinics. Folks have heard that we have stood up a large center in Rock County and recently have announced additional community-based vaccination centers, as well as we have the ability per the local health department to bring in mobile vaccination teams. And it's important to note that the health departments are really coordinating a lot of these efforts at the local jurisdiction level. Next slide, please. Okay, and so with that, there's so many resources. We were asked about if we had resources to share, and it's hard to pick, so I would just recommend that you take a look at our website. There's all sorts of information there, including the information that I have gone through and more, both on the vaccine safety, both on the eligibility and more, and as well as resources for you to use with employees. And so I would really recommend going to that. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Myman.
Great, thanks, Stephanie, for that great overview. So I'm going to kind of move on to the next part here, and this is really based on feedback that we got kind of before this webinar about questions and issues that we're coming up with employers. So we want to try to answer just a few of these, and I really wanted to focus on these three main questions in the next few minutes, which are mainly how are employers approaching vaccination? What can employers do to encourage vaccination amongst the workforce, because that's going to be very important. And then just what are some of the practical considerations that Stephanie already touched on briefly. So in terms of what are employers doing, I think some of you or most of you may have received a survey that was conducted jointly through the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation and DHS in late July and early February. And this was a non-scientific survey. It was really just kind of a rapid assessment of what was going on in the private sector and also including some nonprofits, and just to really get at some of the attitudes and approaches and questions that employers had. So we had a fairly good response, about 4,400, and you can see that it was a pretty diverse group of people who responded from a diverse variety of industry sectors. And then you can kind of see on the lower right there that the majority of respondents really came from small employers, although we had a few up the top. And so there were a couple interesting findings from this that I wanted to share with you that I think have some bearing on ways we can work together going forward. So the first major takeaway and question that we just asked was just kind of how important do you feel as an employer is vaccinating your entire workforce? And you can see the majority by far think it's either extremely or moderately important, which was very encouraging. Although I'd point out nearly a quarter of respondents to the survey only felt it was either slightly important or not important at all, which I think speaks to just the need to do more education, more outreach, and just kind of raise this up as an issue. I imagine most folks tuned into this webinar recognize that, but we need to make sure this message is going out far and wide. The next thing we asked was just what role do you as an employer potentially see playing in workforce and vaccination of the workforce? And most of the responses set around kind of logistical concerns, or providing employers or employees or workers with information on where they can get vaccinated, how they can get them referred to their healthcare provider, with smaller proportions talking about providing education, and then about a third saying kind of no role at all, that it was the choice of employees. And as I'll talk about in a second here, I think when we look at kind of what we think are the trusted messengers, employers are actually in probably a very good spot to help get out some of these messages and really help play an important role, and also has benefits for businesses as well. I think one of the more interesting takeaways here is we asked kind of a subset, because we know a lot of employers have surveyed their workers to try to get at what's the level of vaccine acceptance, or on the flip side, what's the level of vaccine hesitancy. And about over 60% feel that more than 80% of the workforce is willing to get vaccinated, which is encouraging. However, I'm sure as everybody has read, to get to a point where we think we might have herd immunity, it's going to require a really large portion of the population to get vaccinated. And you can see, a pretty substantial number of employers who have surveyed their workers have found significant levels of vaccine hesitancy, with 10 and 13% thinking the level of acceptance may be less than 60%. So why is that? Well, we kind of asked the respondents why they think that may be the case. And really kind of what rose to the top were concerns about vaccine safety. And I'm glad Stephanie was able to touch on that briefly. And this is kind of consistent with what we've seen in national polling as well. So what's the best way to get through to workers and deliver messages about the science and the efficacy of these vaccines? Well, and inquiring for employers about who they felt were the most trusted messengers, local healthcare providers actually rose to the top. But shortly behind that, we're just kind of public health agencies generally, whether that's CDC or Department of Health Services or local public health. But company management, employers also rank company management as being very high as trusted messengers. And I think that's a good thing to capitalize on going forward. So kind of getting to the next part is what can you do as employers, and what are things that, public health can provide, and what are ways we can work together to actually encourage your workforce to get vaccinated. And these really kind of come down to three things, which are, providing some basic education to answer some of these concerns, particularly around safety, or reducing any barriers to vaccination, and then kind of lastly, considering incentives as well. So when it comes to education, the key thing is to utilize trusted messengers. And as I just showed you, the folks on this call, the employers, are seen as trusted messengers, and I think that's a good thing to build on. And then to supplement that with messages from public health as well. I think there's a lot of good synergy between those two groups. So using those trusted messengers, building off that foundation, I think is a great starting point. The other is really getting to those fundamental concerns about vaccine efficacy and safety. And this is just a small screenshot from a CDC webpage. We'll send out all of these links later, but they have a really good webpage with some very basic question of answers for common concerns written in very plain language, which really kind of get at the heart of some of these. And so I encourage folks dialed in to check out those resources, because I think they are very, very well done. And then last is kind of use multiple channels, right? It's not just a poster, it's not just a fact sheet. It's kind of using all the channels that you have, and depending on the size of your business, you may have more or more opportunities or fewer, particularly if you're a smaller one. But CDC has pulled together a really very nice toolkit. There's a screenshot here on the right side that has kind of newsletter content, some key messages, as well as some things like posters that you can hang up in your workplace. These are good. Some are available in multiple languages as well, and they're also written at an appropriate reading level. So moving on to kind of the second thing about reducing barriers, and thinking through this and having talked with employers, I would say it kind of comes down to just a few things here. One is, to the extent that you're capable and able of doing it, providing, short-term paid leave, even if it's for a few hours, to allow employees to go out during the workday and get vaccinated, that just helps reduce any kind of barriers that they may have getting vaccination. And I think that's something that'll really help encourage it. The other that I'll talk about a little bit more is that there are, on some occasions, people do have some side effects, particularly after that second dose, that may prevent them from coming into work. So just making sure they have some policies in place, if possible, to allow those folks to take, a day off if they need it. Again, it's going to kind of reduce concerns about this workers impacting their job. And then last, particularly for larger employers, if we get to a point where we have ample vaccine supply, even doing something like an employer-sponsored vaccine clinic is possible. So the last thing I think to provide or encourage vaccination or incentives, I imagine this is going to be talked about more by some of the other speakers. This is just a headline I saw just a few days ago about Publix kind of joining some other major corporations and offering incentives for workers to get vaccinated. There actually is a fairly good body of evidence on incentives for encouraging vaccination. Not much from COVID, but there are a whole host of vaccines, and there have been a lot of studies, particularly looking at the effectiveness of incentives on influenza vaccination. And I just put a couple bullet points here on two studies that I think are particularly enlightening. One was actually not with healthcare; it was just with workers across 53 sectors. And it was a randomized controlled trial. It was a very good study that looked at a large number of workers. And they found that if you pair an incentive with education, it was by far the most effective way of increasing flu vaccination. I think that's a really important takeaway, and I want folks to kind of come away thinking about that. When you pair multiple things together, it's going to have the biggest effect. And then another study was actually a study of studies, so a meta-analysis, looked at a lot of influenza studies, and they found that, incentives kind of on average reduce the number of unvaccinated, at least among healthcare workers, by about 30%. So again, fairly effective. So I just want to wrap up with a few practical considerations before we pass it on that really just touch on side effects that Stephanie already discussed: staggering vaccination, quarantine, and then the importance of keeping safety measures in place for now. So in terms of side effects, Stephanie mentioned VSafe. It's one of the monitoring systems where people can report symptoms. And this is a picture from a recent publication from CDC. And what I've done here is just pulled together kind of the vaccine side effects over time that people report after the first dose of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine and then the second dose. And this really just confirms kind of what Stephanie was already talking about, which is if you look at the number of days kind of from left to right on those charts, the side effects are generally very short-lived. They tend to be minor. The most common one is injection site pain. And after a couple days, most of the side effects have passed. They tend to be a little more significant after the second dose of mRNA vaccines. And in those cases, after that second dose, people may have, occasionally they may have some fever or fatigue, but again, passes quickly and tends to be relatively minor. So what to do if employees have some of these side effects? CDC has already kind of talked about this a little bit, although I imagine we're going to have more information. I think bottom line kind of boils down to two things. For things that we would expect to be as a result of a vaccine, common side effects like fever, fatigue, chills, and muscle aches, I think ideally employees should kind of stay home if they're feeling that unwell until they can get evaluated, or at least talk to a healthcare provider. If they have a fever, once that fever resolves and they're feeling well enough to go back to work, okay to get them back in at that point. I would point out one caution, which is if there are other symptoms that are not associated with the vaccine, so cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, loss of taste or smell, those are symptoms that would not be seen with the vaccine, and those workers should get tested for COVID-19. It does happen occasionally. Somebody may be exposed to COVID-19 right before they get vaccinated, and they may actually end up developing COVID-19 before they've developed immunity. So a little difficult sometimes to tease out some of these symptoms, but just important to keep in mind that most people have minor symptoms, they can get back to work. There are some symptoms that require some further assessment by a healthcare provider. Staggering vaccination, I think Stephanie already addressed this really well. I'll just point out a couple of pros and cons. Staggering vaccination, clearly if you have, a handful of really highly essential personnel, maybe some that can only do 2 people or the only ones at a company that can run a particularly critical process, certainly could make sense to stagger that. And it's going to be particularly important after that second dose of an mRNA vaccine when they may have more side effects. The downside, these are kind of pros and cons, is that, if you do complex staggering with a large workforce, it's going to be logistically challenging potentially with a 2-dose series. And if we get to a point where we have a lot of vaccine available and you have a large number of workers, staggering could kind of maybe lead some delays rather than just doing the entire workforce at once. But again, it's going to vary on vaccine supply and the nature of your operations. And then kind of the last thing I wanted to point out here, just in one of the last things for practical considerations is quarantine. This is a question that came up, or started to come up more and more. So CDC just issued recent guidance about quarantine after vaccination, which DHS has adopted. And so for somebody who is fully vaccinated and is exposed to somebody with COVID-19, quarantine is not required if we kind of meet 3 basic criteria. The person who is exposed is fully vaccinated, they're within 3 months of their last dose, and they don't have any symptoms. And that's graphically what's shown below. You can see after the last dose of a vaccine, which could be your second dose of an mRNA vaccine, or potentially a single dose vaccine. After 2 weeks, that person would be considered fully vaccinated. And if they're exposed between those 2 weeks and the end of those 3 months, quarantine is not going to be required if they don't have symptoms. And I think this is one of the biggest benefits of this of vaccination. It really does help protect your workforce. It really does help prevent disruptions in operations, and it definitely protects workers quite well. Then one thing I'll just wrap up on, this is from a previous talk I gave with this group when we were talking about workplace safety measures, this kind of Swiss cheese model of COVID-19 defense. And this basically just talks about all the things we need to do to keep workers safe and keep businesses going, from educating employees about being safe outside of work to creating a safe work environment, testing, tracing, isolation, and quarantine. I'll just point out again that, kind of the last slice and these layers of protection is vaccination. It's not that it's the least important, it's incredibly important, but it's one part of a bunch of measures that we need to maintain for now. There are some uncertainties kind of going forward that, we're still trying to ramp up vaccine supply. We still have some new variants that are emerging, although the vaccines appear to be effective. But, for the next few months, one thing that I kind of consistently emphasize is the need to keep doing the things we know work now to protect workers and keep businesses open. So for the time being, until we can get a large proportion of the population vaccinated, it's important to, keep masking, keep physically distancing. If you have testing programs, do that. Work with public health for contact tracing. All of these will help keep the businesses open and keep your workers safe. So with that, I think that kind of comes to the end of our presentation, and I think I will hand it back over to our next speaker here.
Thank you so much. That was amazing content. I feel lucky that I got to be on this panel and hear all of that really helpful information. So good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Davis. I am a partner at Quarles & Brady in the Labor and Employment Practice Group. And my job essentially is to work with employers of all sizes across many different industries and provide them with practical counsel and solutions to their employment needs on a variety of issues, including, of course, the development of vaccination programs, which is what I will be talking about today. Happily, much of the information that I was planning to cover has already been touched on in some ways by our last panelist, and they of course are the experts and have lots of detailed information, so I think that's great. You will see some consistent themes in my remarks today. So let's just take a look here at what I'm hoping to accomplish in our brief time together. Really what I want to do is walk through what I see as the three main approaches for workplace vaccination programs. And with each of those, I want to talk about the positives and the downsides, and then also talk through which approach might be one that's a strong contender for your particular industry or type of employer. And then kind of provide some practical advice on next steps as you look towards selecting and implementing a vaccination program. Time permitted, we might talk about some of the anticipated issues after we get to a place where there's more widespread availability of the vaccination. But I know that a couple of our other panelists will be covering some of those topics, so I won't spend too much time on that. So without further ado, let's sort of jump into it here. And I think that our last two panelists gave us a good picture of what has transpired up to this point. Where are we at? We know that we have 2 vaccinations that have received emergency use authorization from the FDA, and one that appears to be on the cusp of that. And since about December, states have been rolling out the vaccines to their citizens, largely in accordance with the CDC's phased vaccine rollout recommendations. I know that many of you that are participating in today's webinar have Wisconsin employer sites, but also have locations throughout the country, or maybe even broader than that. And it's important to note that all of the states are at different places in their rollout of the vaccine. And so with all of this, it's important to be aware of what state-specific requirements are in place, and also, you know, what are the trends within the communities that you're operating, because that is going to be a significant factor that you'll want to think through and consider as you're selecting a vaccination program. We know that many employers are really just starting to think about this, and that makes sense because, again, we're waiting for wider spread vaccination availability. And we're going to talk through first what I sort of call option 1. And this is a compulsory vaccination program. And I want to start off here by saying what I mean by compulsory vaccination program is a program under which all employees, or perhaps a certain subset or category of employees, are required to receive a vaccination as a condition of employment. You may be asking from your computer, can you even do that? Is that allowed? And the answer is yes. It is possible for employers to mandate the vaccine. We've seen guidance from the EEOC that confirms that, and we know that in fact there are employers who have implemented already mandatory vaccination programs. So you can do it, and then the question is, should you do it? Is this a good fit for you? To kick it off, I'll start by talking about some of the positives of a compulsory vaccination program, and there are many. I think the biggest one is the impact that it has on protecting your workplace and community health, basically. So COVID-19 vaccines are one of the most effective medical strategies to prevent the really adverse impacts of COVID-19, right? So we know the vaccines that are out there are highly effective at keeping people out of the hospital and preventing COVID-19 related deaths. And so that certainly is one reason to think seriously about whether a compulsory vaccination program makes sense. In addition to that, and sort of more nuts and bolts for you employers, is a compulsory program is going to be effective at reducing the cost of absences and lost productivity that result from positive and significant COVID-19 cases, and also the need of employees to quarantine if they've been exposed to individuals with COVID-19. Dr. Maiman happily covered the CDC guidance that was released relating to quarantining after you've been fully vaccinated for COVID-19. And you can see that requiring your employees to stay home for 7, 10, or 14 days if they've been exposed to a positive COVID-19 case, will significantly decline as you're able to get individuals fully vaccinated. Another upside clearly is that a mandatory vaccination program will allow your business to open if you've been closed, and hopefully to stay open. We know that one positive COVID-19 test amongst your workforce can, in some cases, lead an employer to have to fully stop operations, to shut down certain aspects of your plant floor. And these impacts can be seen particularly in industries like dining and hospitality. So higher vaccination rates, which can be accomplished through a compulsory vaccination program, can accelerate a return to normal and make it safer for you to get your operations back to a close to normal place, and also signal to your customers and clients that you have a safe environment for them to enter into. From a legal standpoint, a compulsory program may give you some shield against civil liability. We know that sort of one of the things employers are looking to the forefront at are whether we're going to start to see claims under tort law that employers failed to take reasonable care to protect their employees in the midst of the pandemic. If you take the step of requiring vaccination, you're basically saying we're doing absolutely everything that we can to protect against and to provide our employees with a safe workforce. And so that may decrease the likelihood that you would see those types of civil suits down the road. It also may be helpful from an enforcement action standpoint. So right now, OSHA has taken the position that employers will satisfy their general duty to provide a safe workplace to employees that is free from recognized hazards that could cause serious harm if they are doing things like requiring PPE, requiring physical distancing, etc. But we know that OSHA is also tasked with sort of reviewing what their practices have been during the pandemic, and so we could see some changes here. So the implementation of a mandatory program could help protect against future enforcement actions. So given all of these upsides, as well as factors like the likelihood of exposure of your workforce, so what's the risk, what's the level of COVID cases in your community, have you had major outbreaks in your facilities, there are many industries and employers that will want to sort of think hard about whether they implement some version of a compulsory program. And you'll see I've listed some of them on the slides here. And it's sort of interestingly, they kind of track the vaccination rollout, right? So when we look at who is sort of highest on the list in terms of the ones that we're prioritizing to receive the vaccine, some of these industries are going to be popping up on that list as well. So we're talking about things like the healthcare industry, where there is a high level of contact between caregivers and patients who are likely vulnerable to COVID-19. Again, the dining and hospitality industry, their CDC continues to recommend that businesses close off any areas that were used by sick individuals for 24 hours. And so you think about the potential disruption to your business and how can you try to reduce that as much as possible. Any kind of customer serving business will want to think about whether this is a possibly the right approach for them. And that's because you're probably striving to do whatever you can to make your customers feel as comfortable as possible patronizing your business. If you can say we require vaccination for all of our employees, that might help in that regard. Also, businesses where employees have to, as a result of the nature of your facilities or the nature of your business, work in close proximity to one another. In these settings, we're finding that not only is the potential spread of COVID-19 sort of greater because of that proximity issue, but also we're seeing instances of PPE-related friction between employees that's impacting morale at the workplace. So again, a mandatory program in the long term will expedite a return to what is more normal working conditions for your employees. As we heard from our last panelist, simply because you implement a mandatory vaccination program, that doesn't mean that you can, at the sort of flip of a switch, eliminate all of the other modifications you've put in place for COVID-19. We need to get to that herd immunity place before you would even want to seriously consider that. But you're likely to hit that threshold much quicker through a compulsory vaccination program than through the other types that we'll talk about. So these are some of the industries that will want to think about whether a compulsory program might be a good fit. There are also downsides to this approach, and I'm going to talk about some of them. One thing that we're seeing is early survey information from about mid-January found that only 6% of employers plan to implement a mandatory vaccination program once the vaccines have received full FDA approval. So you might be asking, well, why is that the case? Why isn't this a more popular approach? And here are some of the potential reasons for that. I talked about how, interestingly, a mandatory program can reduce some types of potential liability, but the flip side of that coin is you also increase some types of potential legal liability. And this comes generally by way of potential liability under workers' compensation law or general tort law, when you're requiring employees to receive a vaccination, and then they may potentially experience adverse impacts or losses resulting from that mandated vaccination. So you could face exposure for those types of claims. In addition, we'll talk about, and you'll see on the slide here, that if you go forward with a mandatory program, you have to put in place a really robust system for addressing when employees request exemption from your vaccination requirement. So we know that under federal and state discrimination laws, employers have to consider exemptions from vaccination requirements for individuals who have a medical condition that might prevent them from being able to receive a vaccine, or from those who have honestly held religious or religious-like beliefs. Under those scenarios, you need to have your HR team prepared to handle requests for exemption. You need to be prepared to know what information you can and can't ask for. And then you need to be prepared to think through whether there's an accommodation that can be put in place that will allow that employee to continue working either remotely or in the physical workspace without posing a direct threat to the rest of your workforce. So that is a really sort of significant administrative undertaking that employers who want a mandatory vaccination program are going to have to be prepared to undertake. And with it comes risk, right? Because you may say to someone, we can't accommodate your request for an exemption, and that brings with it the possibility that they'll bring some sort of discrimination claim down the road. In addition to that, and sort of really practically speaking here, if you're going to implement a mandatory vaccination program, you need to be prepared to enforce it. And what that really means is you have to be prepared to discipline and or terminate employees who refuse to comply. We do know that despite all of our efforts to do education relating to the COVID-19 vaccination, there is some distrust of it, and we're, I think, all working hard to try to address that issue. But it means that really there may be a somewhat significant portion of your workforce who is disinclined to get the vaccination. And are you in a position and are you going to be willing to say, we're going to discipline or we're going to terminate those employees for refusing to comply with our mandatory program? So in light of all of that, again, if you're in some of these industries where perhaps you have a high union presence, you may have to negotiate with your union about mandatory vaccination, and you may not be successful in those negotiations. This may not be a good fit for you. Likewise, if you're not in what I would call sort of the high risk work environment, this may not be the right fit for you. It's going to sort of be, it may be hard or difficult to sell to your workforce that mandatory vaccination is necessary when we know many large companies like Facebook and Walgreens have issued statements saying they're not going to require employees to take vaccines. And so you're going to want to be prepared to sort of justify to your workforce why we feel a compulsory vaccination program is necessary. And that's going to be a bit harder to do if you're not in one of these sort of high risk work environments. If mandatory vaccination seems like it might be a good fit for you, here's what we're sort of recommending to employers that they do now. Again, do this now before there's widespread availability of the vaccine so that you're ready and prepared when that time does come. You're going to need to determine how to track compliance and identify what proof of vaccination will be required. It is permissible to request some sort of proof of vaccination. Generally, what we've been recommending is that you ask for a copy of the vaccination card, right? So it'll show when the employee received both doses of whichever vaccine was available to them and have the relevant dates for that as well. You should treat that record as a confidential medical document, which means it needs to be stored separate from the employee's personnel file, and it should only be accessible really to your HR professionals and shared on a needs to know basis only. So think of it as you would any other piece of medical documentation and make sure you're protecting the confidentiality of it. You will want to put in place a plan to process those exemption requests, medical and religious. Here, I just want to pause to say that the point of the exemptions is to consider whether a exemption is going to pose a direct threat of substantial harm to the health or safety of your employee or of others that cannot be eliminated by reasonable accommodation. So there may be circumstances in which you can say, I'm able to minimize the risk to my workforce, even if this employee can't get a vaccination, by allowing them to continue working from home for a period of time, by putting in place additional workplace modifications, by limiting some of the tasks they perform. Or we're going to say, if you can't be vaccinated, that's okay, but we're not going to allow you to participate in in-person meetings, for instance, or have direct contact with our customers, for instance. Remember that the requirement to accommodate religious beliefs or comprehensive religious type of philosophical systems is not the same as a need to accommodate political, scientific, or medical views. There is no exemption for those types of views. We are only concerned with honestly held religious beliefs or religious-like beliefs. You're going to need to train your employees who will be tasked with communicating about your vaccination program to be able to spot requests for exemption or accommodation and to know how to deal with them when they come up. So they should be referred to your HR team if you have one, and then it should be HR that engages in the interactive process and determines what sort of documentation, if any, to request. You will want to assess how to minimize and, if possible, eliminate vaccination costs to employees. Some of the ways that you can do that are by providing paid time off to receive the vaccine. Think about whether you need to offer childcare. Think about whether you can offer other incentives to make the cost of receiving the vaccine as minimal as possible. And then, as our previous panelists talk about, anticipate employee time off requests and sort of build that into the program that you develop. The staggering is a great recommendation as the vaccine becomes more widely available, but plan for the potential that employees may need a day or two off of work after receiving a vaccination dose to recover from potential side effects. And then you're going to want to, no matter what program you develop, create and communicate a vaccination policy that lays out employee requirements, your exemption process, and any other sort of relevant procedures. And then that also anticipates and provides answers to the most common questions, such as, will I get time off? Will I receive pay? Etc. So you're going to want to have a policy in place before you implement your program and begin expecting employees to comply with it. So with that, and I know I'm running out of time, let's continue and move on to the second option, which is employer-encouraged vaccination programs. This by far is what I think we're seeing emerge as the most popular option. And it's the option where instead of requiring vaccine, employers do what they can to encourage or incentivize the most number of employees to receive the vaccine. And you can do that through a variety of carrots and sticks. We are seeing a growing number of large US chains offering employees incentives to get vaccines. For example, Houston Methodist, which is one of the largest hospital systems in Texas, is offering its employees what they call HOPE bonuses, $500 bonuses to encourage them to receive the vaccine. And there's sort of countless other options of or examples of similar programs employees have implemented. What are the positives here? I think this is a good approach for morale and retention. It's sort of the middle ground where you're messaging to your employees that you take the pandemic very seriously, that you want to do whatever you can to prevent against the spread of COVID-19 and provide a safe workplace. But it also sort of toes the line in terms of recognizing that there are some people who have fear or reluctance to proceed with getting the vaccine. It comes with the sort of benefit of some administrative ease, because when you're not requiring vaccination, you don't have to be concerned with that whole exemption process that we talked about for individuals with medical conditions or religious beliefs. And so when you're not requiring the vaccine, you don't have to provide the, exemptions, because you're saying, here, we want you to get the vaccine, we're going to encourage you to get it, but we're not going to mandate it. And then, again, potentially less liability for risk from discrimination complaints because you don't have to worry about that exemption issue, right? So you're not going to have employees who say, I was improperly denied an exemption or an accommodation because of my medical condition or my religious beliefs. So in light of those upsides, the employers who might want to consider this type of vaccination program are ones where your employees don't have to be physically in close contact with each other, which helps to sort of reduce down this risk of spread. If you're a workplace that has been able to pretty successfully accommodate remote work, but you would like to be able to sort of wind that down at some point, or you're in the process of winding that down, encouraged vaccination programs might be a good fit for you. You want to sort of signal to your employees that while we've been able to tolerate remote work, we can't do that forever. We need to get back to, again, what was our pre-pandemic normal. And here's one of the ways that we're going to strive to do that. What are some of the downsides of this approach? One of them is that, traditionally, while incentivizing vaccines has some positive results, it doesn't result in 100% or even close to 100% compliance. And so again, it's not the most effective way of getting your full workforce vaccinated. That would be the compulsory program that we previously talked about. And I think that while we've seen success in things like flu vaccination, incentivization, and education, there's some reason to sort of question whether we'll see similar success rates here. And that's chiefly because of the uncertainty and disinformation surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. There is also this argument floating around out there that it's potentially possible that you could create incentives that are so enticing that they become coercive or are viewed as discriminatory when certain individuals feel they can't receive the incentive because they have a medical condition or a religious belief that prevents them from going forward with vaccination. I think that risk is relatively low because the reality is you're not sort of singling out individuals with medical conditions or religious beliefs to not receive those incentives. It's anyone who chooses not to get the vaccine. Employers who might not want to consider this program or for whom an encouraged vaccination program might not be the best fit are sort of the opposite of what I've said already, right? So if you do have a workplace where close contact is necessary or where you're servicing the public or vulnerable populations, this might not be the best option for you. And so you'll want to think about that given sort of all the particularities of your workforce. And then the last before I get to the last program, what should you do now if you're considering an encouraged vaccination program? One thing I want to caution you about is not relying upon waivers. We are seeing some employers who are considering requiring a waiver that basically indicates that an employee who chooses not to be vaccinated understands the medical risks of that decision and accepts any associated risk. The idea here is that you're trying to sort of get in front of those civil suits saying an employer who did only a encouraged vaccination program didn't provide a fully safe workforce or work environment for me. But the enforceability of these waivers is questionable, and frankly, particularly for multi-state employers, there's different state requirements that come into play about what such a waiver would have to include to even be potentially enforceable. So you don't want to over-rely upon them. Instead, you're going to want to continue to take a thoughtful approach to PPE, to distancing requirements, to all of the modifications that you've put in place to protect against the spread of COVID. Again, get creative. Think about carrots and sticks to encourage vaccination. Carrots, of course, are things like the HOPE bonus, paid time off, allowing employees who choose to receive the vaccine to get the time off both for the vaccine and potentially afterward as needed, reimbursement for transit and childcare costs. Those are just some examples. When I say sticks or disincentives, what I'm talking about is sort of reminding employees that if they are exposed to individuals with COVID, they are going to be required to quarantine. They may not be entitled to paid time off for that significant amount of absence that will be required if they're exposed and unvaccinated. So sort of remind them of the practical implications of not getting a vaccine as well. As always, create and communicate a vaccination policy and talk with your employees and educate them about vaccinations and steps to proceed with getting one. And then finally, what I wanted to cover is a voluntary vaccination program. This is sort of the path of least resistance in some respects. It's where you don't take a real strong position on whether employees should or should not get vaccination. You leave it to them. You don't encourage it. You don't incentivize it. I think that there is, in some respects, a belief that this sort of hands-off approach means that an employer can avoid lots of the downsides that we've talked about. But I just want to caution you that that is not the case, that even with a purely voluntary vaccination program, there's going to be downsides and there's going to be steps that employers have to take nonetheless. So before I get to those, let's talk about some of the positives. One of them relates to sort of the legal risks here. One thing that we've talked about is right now, the status quo is that the vaccines are being made available under an emergency use authorization. And part of that emergency use authorization is that individuals who receive the vaccine have to be informed that they have the option to accept or refuse the vaccine and that they're proceeding voluntarily. There is an argument that if employees are too incentivized or required to receive a vaccine, then they don't really have the option of refusing or accepting the vaccine and could theoretically come up with some sort of legal claim if they were terminated or disciplined for refusing to receive a vaccine. I think this risk is probably stronger with public employers where the perception is that you're the state or the federal government that's requiring vaccination or too strongly incentivizing vaccine. The other thing is that at some point, these vaccines likely will have the full approval of the FDA, though we don't know exactly when that will occur. But in this sort of in-between time that we're in, it's possible that you are reducing legal risk under the emergency use authorization by simply allowing employees to choose for themselves whether to receive the vaccine. Another upside here is similar to the incentivize or encourage. You are probably reducing some administrative costs. Again, you don't have to worry about putting in place the exemption process, the accommodation process that would be required for a mandatory program. And you also don't need to worry about sort of processing your incentives, obtaining proof of vaccination, those sorts of things. I think there are some upsides to a voluntary vaccination program. And for that reason, some industries that might want to consider this approach. The biggest ones are industries where your workforce is and can continue to be primarily remote. So that may be things like computer and information technology, account project management, customer service, marketing, finance, etc. Other employers who might consider this approach are ones who have been in really strict compliance with public health guidelines and have no record of workplace outbreaks, things like the construction industry, for instance. But again, some potential downsides here. There is that risk of legal exposure on the other side of the coin where, again, you face potentially these claims under workers' compensation or tort or OSHA requirements that you're not doing the most you can to provide a safe workforce for your employees. There are potentially harmful business implications. Again, if you're customer or client facing and you have seen a significant dip in the ability to sort of attract people to your business, you lose the advantage of being able to say, we require vaccinations. Here are all of the things that we're doing to make it safe for you to come to our business and visit us. And then there could be adverse morale and retention implications. One of the things we saw from our last panelist is a lot of employees want to receive the vaccine and want to have the ability to do that, and may look negatively upon an employer who is not doing what they can to encourage it. A purely voluntary vaccination program may not be a good fit for the industries where there's the highest risk of exposure. Some of the same industries we talked about as potentially wanting to consider mandatory vaccination. If you're going to go this route, again, it would be a mistake to assume that simply because you adopt a purely voluntary program, you can avoid questions or concerns from your employees about the vaccine. You still need to be prepared. You'll still want to distribute educational materials regarding the vaccine and create and communicate a effective vaccination policy. And with that, and in the interest of time and knowing what our next panelists are going to cover, I'm going to turn it over to them, although I had a couple more slides to cover because I think they're going to address many of these issues. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today, and look forward to answering any questions at the end of our time together.
Oh, Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Molson Coors Beverage Company vaccine policy. And Jolene knows me well enough that I am so technologically incapable that she is going to move the slides forward. So Jolene, if you could move that. Next slide, please. So a couple of things when it comes to a vaccine policy. A lot of it is determined not only by, at the end of the day, what your policy is, but how you come to that conclusion and how you structure yourself. So I thought it might be helpful to give you a bit of our company's decision-making framework as it came to the entire pandemic. So we have a crisis management framework. A lot of people have that, of course. Not a single person on that task force would have guessed in a million years that we would still be here almost a year after the start of that process. But this task force has people from HR, from legal, from government affairs, from communications, from operations, from health and safety. They all play a key part in determining what those policies are. We are a multi-state organization, as you probably know, so we monitor everything from positivity rates to local ordinances, and in fact our government affairs folks are heavily engaged in talking to folks around what their policies or their ordinance might be to determine the impact on our business. Of course, bars and restaurants are really important to us, and so we monitor all that stuff as part of our task force, and we report out to our senior leadership team 2 times a week, and we've been doing that for almost a year now to keep those folks abreast of what's going on, and has had a huge impact on how we operate our business, from not only our operations, but how we market and sell and our advertising and all of those types of things. Jolene, could you go to the next slide, please? So we have some guardrails that have influenced our policies around COVID-19, from our pay policies to our vaccine policies. And first guideline is put people first. I know everybody talks about that, but we've actually tried very hard to put that into action. It impacted our decision, for example, to increase the pay of our brewery workers during the initial part of our campaign. It impacted how we pay people that we put on quarantine. We gave everybody 160 hours of pay, and we replenished that bank as of January 1 of this year for anybody that's on quarantine. Another guardrail that we have, and this is having an impact on our vaccine policy in particular, is we are trying as best we can to operate as a North American entity. That's Canada, the US, and Latin America, more so Canada and the US than Latin America. And that actually has some restrictions or parameters around what we can really do as we're trying to operate as a single entity. And I'll point some of those things out. Additionally, as an essential business, of course, beer is an essential business. We have never shut down our breweries, and in deference to that, we tend to prioritize the needs of our operation people over that of our non-operational people. In other words, when we design our policies, whether it's our pay policies around quarantine pay or our vaccine policy, we will prioritize those folks that have been out on the floor above all of the other folks that are working in corporate offices or out in the field. So, Jolene, can you change the slide, please? Terrific. So the first thing I say, and this is just part and parcel of this pandemic, is everything is subject to change. Everything we've done has started in one place and changed, from our pay policies to our quarantine policies as we follow CDC guidelines. And sometimes the CDC publishes changes and they don't necessarily tell you, and their website isn't so easy to navigate, but we monitor all of that. And so whatever I tell you today clearly is subject to change depending upon what happens out in the pandemic environment. So, we're doing a lot of the things that Lindsay talked about, and those were considerations that we had as we came to our policy. Now, as you're going to see, however, because everything is unique to an organization, we are not doing some of the things that maybe Lindsay or Dr. Meehan had said are best practices, but that's specific to us, and there are specific reasons for those things. So, for example, like most employers, we are not mandating the vaccine. We're encouraging it. It's not FDA approved. There is emergency use authorization only. We could mandate it, but that doesn't really help right now because most people can't get it. We have the ability to maintain social distancing within our operations. And so one of the things we track, and I'm sure many of you do the same thing, is we track every single positive case, site by site. We've had, unfortunately, in Canada and the US, we've had over 700 positive cases in our employee population. Less than 4% of those are related to in-operation exposures. In other words, we're one employee that through contact tracing we identified had the virus and infected another, and virtually all of those were the result of our employees failing to follow our protocols. And in fact, quite honestly, we have terminated at least one employee for failing multiple times to follow protocols. We're not retail or consumer facing. Inability to have any real consequences in Canada. So Lindsay talked about, well, if you have a policy, you have to do something for those people who violate that policy. And so in Canada, it's really hard. You can have a mandatory policy, but it's really hard to have any teeth to that policy. And in fact, it's not even clear that you could have a mandatory policy in Canada because, quite frankly, we've been really successful at not having our people exposed within our breweries. We have a really strong focus on our D&I policy, and we've heard a lot, not necessarily here, but we've heard a lot, I'm sure, about certain ethnicities having concerns over getting the virus for various cultural and historical reasons. And quite frankly, we did not want to get into having to deal with those sort of negative reactions in that particular environment. We didn't want to have to deal with the record-keeping issues and the religious opt-outs and all of those things. And certainly we are a unionized organization and wanted to maintain strong union relationships. So for all of those reasons, we have decided that we were not or are not going to mandate the vaccine policy. Jolene? So contrary to maybe what quote unquote best practice is, we are not going to provide special pay for persons getting the vaccine on company time. When we do benefit surveys, we typically find that our paid time off ranks in the top 5% of those companies that we survey. And so we don't believe that we need to provide any incremental pay. People will get paid for their time off simply because they have enough of it already. That's also consistent with not mandating the policy. I think if we had made the decision to mandate the vaccine, we might have said, well, we're going to give you some extra pay so that you don't have to use your PTO in order to get paid for that. But we didn't, that's not consistent with what our position is. The other thing is relative to incentives is at this point, we're not going to provide any special incentive to employees to get the vaccine. And again, some of this, the decisions that you make actually comes down to your leadership and what their general opinions are. And our leadership had a bias against simply paying people to get the vaccine, but we did look at a variety of other incentive programs. So for example, what about providing points or things of that nature under our wellness program? We do, for example, incent people to get the flu vaccine. The problem is, and this gets back to our philosophy as one North American entity, that while we have a very robust wellness program in the United States, we do not have a robust or the same type of wellness program in Canada. So we struggled with how to come up with a consistent way to provide those types of incentives. We talked about giving extra vacation days, but again, as I already mentioned, we have very generous paid time off programs. And in fact, we have a meaningful percent of our population that actually loses vacation every year. And that might have been viewed by some employees as sort of, you know, the old saying, you just gave the sleeves out of your vest because I can't use this extra vacation, or I haven't used this extra vacation anyway. And then we talked about gift cards or more free beer, but could not come up, quite frankly, with an incentive that we thought that would work across all of our operations, that would be equally viewed positively. And so at the end of the day, at this point, we are simply not providing any special incentives to get the vaccine. Jolene? So I just spent a fair amount of time telling you what we're not doing. Let me tell you a little bit about what we are doing. So we're certainly, like most employers, working to facilitate employee knowledge of the vaccine. We've created a company, what we call an internet microsite with information. A lot of that is from the CDC, providing information on how to register for the vaccine. Of course, that's a challenge because different jurisdictions are certainly doing it differently. We're leveraging our employee resource groups to specifically target certain groups to provide information and vaccine encouragement. So for example, yesterday, we partnered our African American Employee Network, one of our resource groups, partnered with United Airlines, and we held a webinar mainly for our Chicago area employees that included prominent Black physicians and researchers in the Chicagoland area, talking about how important it was for the Black community to be vaccinated, why this is different, for example, in terms of what happened in the Tuskegee experiments way back in the 30s. So there was a lot of cultural and historical information that was relevant that we utilize to hopefully encourage that specific population, and we'll be doing more of that as well. We do have a couple of on-site clinic vendors. We have a clinic in Milwaukee. We also have one in Golden, Colorado, and we're working with them to attempt to obtain the vaccine as best we can. A lot of challenges with that. Wisconsin in particular keeps changing things on us. When we think we might be in line, then we're not. But that's why we have the task force. We are doing at those locations employee surveys and registration. So we want to actually know how many employees will get the vaccine if it's available at our clinic. We definitely do not want to over order, and we definitely want to have an orderly way in which we can vaccinate employees for all of the reasons that Dr. Meeman had mentioned in terms of post-vaccination impact. We continue to monitor state requirements, and we provide information to our employees when states provide us information. So for example, some of the states, Virginia in particular, is using VAMS, the Vaccine Administration Management System that was developed by the CDC, but is voluntary. The state told us they will reach out to us when it's our employee's turn to be vaccinated as an essential worker. And if we can upload the employee name and email address into VAMS, that will greatly facilitate employees getting the vaccine. So we're sending a survey to our employees there, asking permission to do that. So those are the types of things, working locally with healthcare providers, large hospitals, maybe in a particular rural area, local pharmacies in order to determine whether or not we can do on-site or near-site vaccinations. And if necessary, we haven't done this yet, we will provide employees letters, if appropriate, validating their status as essential workers once we validate with the state or the jurisdiction that those parameters have been met. Jolene? So I did mention early on that we did have a quarantine pay policy. We call it our COVID-19 leave and pay policy. That did provide up to 160 hours of pay for people that we quarantine. We have amended that now, and we will provide people pay for post-vaccination side effects. So while we're not paying people anything special, if you will, to get the vaccine, should they have secondary effects, we will provide up to 2 days of pay under our quarantine pay policy. They do have to prove to us that they have had the vaccine. Symptoms must start within 24 hours. And it applies to both vaccines. So if they have side effects for both, we'll pay for both. We are amending our quarantine process to align with CDC guidelines. And the one thing that I'm sure some of you are saying to yourself is like, well, you guys are kind of setting yourself up for abuse in this regard. You know, anybody can tell you that they have side effects and you're going to pay them for 2 days. And the truth is, we know that. We know that we have had abuse by employees of our existing policy, where people continue to use the quarantine pay policy. They leverage that policy along with various local ordinances, or in particular Canada. The way Canada runs things is a little bit different. And yeah, they're abusing the policy. They're getting paid when they shouldn't. But in our view, that's a minor concern relative to the overall impact to the business and doing what's right for our employees. So that's pretty much what our policy is from a vaccine perspective. We have communicated that to all of our employees as well. And so the next thing for us to do is continue to monitor and change as necessary. And while I don't know what those changes will be, I can only say that I'm almost positive that they will occur. So I think that's it for me, and I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Hi there. I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Margaret Hennessy. I'm a pediatrician with Ascension, Wisconsin. I am the medical director for pediatrics in our practice in Racine. I'm also part of a lot of different vaccine groups, including the Wisconsin Immunization Practices group. And so I know a lot about vaccines, and so I spend quite a bit of time talking about vaccines. Moving my slides. Can you forward my slide, please? Next slide. So in preparation for getting our vaccines, now we're obviously a medical group, so we have a leg up. We have an advantage because we know what it takes to do vaccines. But in preparation of that, we spent quite a bit of time developing our workflows through local and national committees. And we developed quite a bit of education materials. So that was really key, I think, even before we got started with giving out vaccines, was educating and educating and educating. And so we had two different ways that we did that. One was through our intranet, which is within our system, and the other one was for our patients as well to be able to get information. And then we had to basically operationalize our vaccine clinics. And it almost felt like we were developing a whole nother clinic on top of it. It took quite a bit of manpower, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The other big thing that as we were doing this, though, is we were very careful to make sure that We provided information, but we also constantly said, okay, who else is not here at the table? Who else needs to be part of this discussion? So that it was a pretty seamless process for us in the very end. But I think it's important to look to your own intranet setup and see what kind of information can we provide for everyone else in our company. Next slide. So here's our launch. Our first vaccinee was Dr. Joseph Weber. He was one of our critical care specialists. And I think what's important that folks need to keep in mind, especially people that may be hesitant to vaccine, is the physicians were first in line. And there's a lot of reasons why that happened. But realistically, we believed strongly enough in the science that we wanted to be first in line. And by now, millions of medical professionals have been vaccinated. And I think that's very telling when you have people who are, I don't know, it seems so new, but millions of us have gotten our vaccines and are very happy we did and had a good experience with the process. And I think that's really important. And I'm not going to lie to you. As soon as I got my doses, I told everyone who asked. I presented out my story, and I was willing to really push how exciting this was. Because for me, this was our way back to normal, whatever normal is for folks. It was our way back to being able to go out to restaurants and to be able to go to the museum and being able to go on vacation. This was, to me, it felt like the beginning of the end of all this we've been going through. Now, of course, there's still some time. I'm not getting crazy yet, but it was a really important step. And like I said, the physicians were right in front saying, me first. I'm not going to have anyone else be the tester for this. Next slide. So if you look at our progress, oops, we lost a slide here. Did it jump 2 slides ahead? No, we have a slide that disappeared, but I will tell you what that slide said. Basically, to date, we have vaccinated at least 43,000 folks as of February 13th. That number is not up to date, obviously, and you can add 6,000 to 10,000 a week, and that includes our employees, our non-affiliated medical personnel, also people that were part of the beginning of the 1B category, so first responders, fire, police. We're now vaccinating people 65 and older in our system. But I want to go through a little bit, and I know we're getting short on time, so I'll try to be careful. But I want folks to understand what it really takes to do a vaccine clinic. And I will tell you, and you're going to see people talk about this, this is different than what we typically would do for flu vaccine. Historically, for flu vaccine, we would set up our clinics and then we'd have somebody go grab the vaccines, bring them back to our office and give us all a dose. And this is a different process. The first thing we needed to do, because we had thousands of people we were trying to vaccinate, is to set up some type of scheduling platform. And there's different IT options for that. So allowing people to schedule their appointments. And scheduling is a bit important, and I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. But we also had to organize the right people. So we needed, with our mRNA vaccines, and you've heard a lot about them already today, but they're pretty delicate vaccines, and you need to make sure someone is really able to properly mix it, make sure it's maintained at the right temperature. And so we had a vaccine manager to do that. That was either a nurse or a pharmacist that had the ability to do that. You need a medical authority, so you need someone to sign an order to allow people to be vaccinated, but you also need somebody to be able to screen for contraindications. And contraindications are conditions where we say, okay, you shouldn't get the vaccine. And you need someone who can do that even on the fly, because it's amazing to me how many questions really still come up about that when people are coming in for vaccine. You need a medical observer. As part of the emergency use authorization, we are expected to see people for 15 minutes, sometimes 30, depending on certain allergies that folks may have. And we're expected to be able to respond to emergencies. Now, we have the advantage being a medical institution, we're ready for this, we're prepared for this, but we do have to be prepared with our ability to respond to severe allergic reactions. And the most severe is anaphylaxis, and that requires a dose of epinephrine. So having medical supplies, having blood pressure cuffs, having a way to monitor folks is really, really important. And then of course you need your vaccinators. We have lots of those in our system. And then the final step of it is we need to be able to document our information into the Wisconsin Immunization Registry. And that's really important for multiple reasons. One is we need to know with this 2-dose series which vaccine you got, so we make sure you get the right one. But medical providers want to know if their patients got the vaccine, and people don't always remember, or they don't always keep the card or the documentation that supports that. So this is very important to get set up. Going back to the step about observation, you need to have a large space for observation. Now I will tell you, I have seen different setups, but we took observation very seriously. We have used our largest room, and we have spaced chairs out 6 feet apart from each other, and we do have people wait for 15 minutes. And we spend some time talking with them. If they have questions during that time, we have some very nice music going on. And it's actually a pretty nice experience, but we needed to use a large space for that. And that's made it a little more challenging to use our individual clinics because we would not necessarily have that amount of space. And then we use multiple communication channels, and we found that we had to give this information out in multiple ways. So we have an email system set up. Most people don't always read their emails. So we also provided multiple emails. We provided virtual vaccine town halls with vaccine experts. And we also continue to talk about this at any forum that we had really available, and really talking about the positivity of being vaccinated. Next slide. So what were our challenges? I think one of the biggest challenges was the technology side of it. So making sure that we had a schedule platform that was easy for us to use, making sure we had folks available to do data entry into the Wisconsin Immunization Registry. The other big challenge with the mRNA vaccines is the cold chain maintenance. Now, what I mean by cold chain is these vaccines are very delicate, and they need to be maintained at a very specific temperature, and you need to be careful about the time that you are using to prep these vaccines. And so we had to map that all out. And initially, we even had thought about potentially bringing vaccine to individual clinics. We even sat down and actually timed it out by the minute, like how long it would take to drive in case, and if there was bad traffic or something like that. And we finally decided that this was a different process than flu vaccines. It made much more sense to centralize our setup. So instead of coming out to the clinics that we normally would do, we centralized it in a location that everyone could come to. Again, time limit on the vaccines, and then the expectation of needing a lot more people was a challenge. It was surprising to us that, and I kept reminding myself, this is one little vaccine. Why is this so complicated? But it really is. And of course, communications, because not everyone reads their emails. That's a big thing. And talking about who's eligible for the vaccine, the scheduling challenges that we were able to overcome. One of the things you've heard quite a bit about today is the potential for side effects, and it's real. It's a real thing. And so we were very careful. We expected this, we anticipated this, and we really kind of pushed out to folks, hey, plan to do your vaccine when you have some time off. We have, we're a hospital, so we're open 7 days a week, but most folks have at least 1 day off during that week. And so we said, try to plan the vaccine on the day when you're having the next day off, in anticipation of potentially having some side effects. We also asked that we had people break up the units. So for example, one of the floors, we would ask, please, not all of you get the vaccine. Half of you get it today, half of you get it next week, so that we were able to actually kind of minimize any problems with that. And I will tell you, I was pleasantly surprised at how much it did not impact our workflow. The biggest side effects with this is arm pain, and that usually presents the day after. And some people will feel very tired. Some people will have muscle aches or headaches. Some people may even get a fever, but the good news is, and this is something I actually have really pushed quite a bit with folks, because we had people who were afraid, is that this is going to be brief. You know, I have a lot of people who are afraid to get vaccines because they're afraid it's going to make them sick. But this sounds kind of dorky, but I was very excited. I had chills the second after my second dose. It lasted for a day, and then that was it. But I was very excited because that was my immune system telling me it's doing a good job. And I really kind of pushed that because I want people not to be so afraid of that. And I had somebody come up to me and say, well, I didn't really have any side effects. Is that okay? It's like, yes, it's okay. The most common side effect is injection site pain. If you had a fever, you would not be able to work technically, but again, that's going to last for a day or two. Any symptoms that go beyond that time period are likely not vaccine related, but could be related to another illness. And so really just talking that up and making sure people planned and making sure we had clinics available to do that. So not having everybody come at one time, but breaking it up during the week and having multiple clinics, including on the weekends, so that people could plan their time to come in. Next slide. So the biggest pieces of advice that I can give you is leading by example. So having your leadership potentially get vaccinated first, I think is important. I think it's important to say we trust this enough that we're going to do it too. We're not going to just have you all do it. I think you need to really educate and educate and educate. And people are going to see a lot of strange stuff on the internet, and so trying to direct them to very reliable sources. So the Wisconsin DHS website is amazing. And I know that Dr. Schauer showed you a slide for that, but that has got amazing information. And it's got great sources on how many vaccines are we giving, you know, what's happening around the vaccine, who's eligible. The FDA has some good information. The CDC also has some good information, and of course the World Health Organization. And I think that it's important to put it out there. We put out emails, posters, anything that we can use to provide people information. I think it's important to be transparent about what a vaccine can and can't do. It's not a magic cure-all. It's not going to fix the world instantly, but it is going to make a huge difference. However, we still want to make sure that people need to be social distancing, washing your hands, being careful, wearing your mask, being careful, because while we know these vaccines are amazing, they're not 100%. And in fact, no vaccine is ever going to be 100%. They're 94 to 95% effective, depending on which product you're using after you've received 2 doses. So that means there's still some people who may not mount a strong enough immune response for a lot of different reasons. But the other part of it is we don't completely know if you could still get infected, but not necessarily have symptoms. There's some science to say that actually that's probably not likely, but we still don't know. And so to be safe, we want to make sure that people are still following mask wearing. And I'd like to think about, when we think about infections in general, viral infections especially, and obviously COVID-19 is a viral infection. I like to use the analogy of an iceberg. The idea with an iceberg is what you see at the top is the people who have symptoms, or the people who potentially are very sick, or people that are hospitalized, or people that have really bad outcomes. That's the part that you see. But the majority of the iceberg is under the surface, and that's the people who have gotten infected in the sense that the virus is living in their nose, but it's not making them feel sick. And that's kind of a dangerous situation if you think about it. The fact that if I don't know I'm sick, or I don't know I'm infected, I should say, I'm not going to be as careful. And so we're saying, please still be careful, still wear your mask, still wash your hands, still do your social distancing, because none of this is 100%. It's all tools that are going to help us get through all of this. And like I said, there's good science to support that the vaccine will reduce this asymptomatic infection rate, but we don't know yet how far that goes. And so I kind of think of this, I have a very good friend of mine who is also a physician, and we both have been fully vaccinated. and we both had the disease as well. So we're going to actually, this weekend, we're going to actually go have lunch, and we'll be careful. We'll probably wear a mask, both wear a mask in the car when we're going there. But we're going to try to have lunch. Now, would I do the same thing with my mom or dad? No. I'm not willing to take that much of a chance. My parents are in their 80s. I'm not willing to take that chance that there's a small percentage. So I think that's what's important to still keep in mind, that there's still a lot of disease and still a lot of infection. So next slide. So some really cool resources that I think are helpful. Now, one of the first resource is our website. We've got the CDC websites that also give you really good information on setting up a clinic. The FDA websites are listed, but what's also really important, and I know DHS, our Wisconsin DHS has pointed to this as well, is the Development Foundation put some really good information together about how we could increase vaccine acceptance by even just the language that we use. And I find it very interesting, and I've been starting to incorporate that as well, is that saying vaccine versus immunization sounds better. Saying vaccine versus injection sounds better. Focusing on your family and yourself is actually goes further than talking about the community, talking about this return to normal. And we've included a link to their tip sheet that gives you some ideas on how you talk about it makes a difference. And like I said, as soon as I had my second dose and knew, excuse me, that I did have some significant side effects, I came right out and said, hey, I had chills that night. The next day I was tired, and then I was good to go. But I was very excited about that because that meant my immune system was doing what it was supposed to be doing. So, and that's all I have to say. I think I caught us up to time a little bit there.
Jolene, great, thank you. Hi everyone, Cheryl DeMars. I know that we are at time, and I hope that you can indulge us with a few more minutes. We first want to take some questions that have come in during the webinar, and this will be a bit of a lightning round. Stephanie and Dr. Myman, if you're still on, I'd like to start with a question for the two of you. And this has to do with the 3-month window, the slide that you showed us with the 3-month window following vaccination. The question is, can you clarify what that means? So someone who's fully vaccinated and gets exposed to the virus our understanding is doesn't have to quarantine if it's within 3 months of their being vaccinated. We're wondering if we've got that right, and if so, do you expect that to extend as we learn more, or is the message that the vaccine is only active for 3 months? Did we lose Stephanie and Dr. Myman?
John, are you available? I believe that was your slide.
Stephanie, Dr. Myman had to depart. He had another
Okay.
presentation at 11.
I can certainly stop, and I will have to drop off right away as well. But,
Thank you.
I think, so that is the time period for which we have solid, robust data when it comes to the quarantine period. As we learn more about the duration of protection, we do anticipate that, that we will see changes, and that may be certainly one area. The duration of protection is not yet known, but they are continuing to study as the cohorts that first received those vaccines in the trials, they continue to go ahead. And so we hope that that will certainly, lengthen out. I think we do anticipate the duration of protection will be long lasting, but we need to have the data to support, and particularly when it comes to issues related to quarantine.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for all of the information that you shared with us, Stephanie. And please extend our thanks to Dr. Myman too. We know you guys are working incredibly hard, and we are so grateful for all the work you're doing in the community and your time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One more question that I'd like to direct to both Lindsay and Jim. So this question has to do with quarantine leave policies. Like many other companies, this participant has a quarantine leave policy, and they're wondering, once employees are able to get vaccinated, or even companies offer vaccine clinics, what are you doing about those quarantine policies? Are you considering, for instance, staff that refuse to get a vaccine no longer being eligible for paid time off for quarantining, but rather needing to use PTO?
Yeah, so I can start first, Jim, if you're okay with that. And I do think this is one area where you can think about the sticks that I mentioned in my presentation. So you may have up to this point had a policy where we are going to give someone paid time off, or of course many employers were required to do that under the FFCRA, which has now expired. If you wanted to, you could consider using this as one of those sticks to try to encourage vaccination, by which I mean you could say to employees, or you could have a policy that says, if you're out of PTO, we're not going to offer you additional paid time off if you need to quarantine. But I would caution you that that comes with certainly potential downsides, including that you may have employees then underreporting if they've been exposed to someone with COVID-19, or not properly reporting their symptoms or fevers. And that certainly could have sort of widespread negative impacts on your workforce. So I think you have to be careful about implementing that sort of policy where we completely eliminate paid time off for necessary quarantine periods.
Yeah, and Lindsay, you said something that's kind of right in line with our conversations. We're not changing our quarantine pay policy at this point in time for exactly the reason that you mentioned, that we want to err on keeping potentially infected people out of our operations at all costs. And again, we know there's going to be abuse here. And the CDC guidelines hasn't really changed all that much. You know, you've got that one period of time where a vaccinated person doesn't have to be quarantined. But when you think about it, that's as it stands today, it's a really relatively small period of time, right? It's from 3 months minus 2 weeks. So at this point, until we get different guidance or things change, we are not going to reduce our COVID-19 pay policies.
Great, thank you both. It seems like COVID is a great opportunity to learn again about the law of unintended consequences, right?
Indeed.
So I know that we are 5 minutes over. I'm going to ask your indulgence to spend 5 more minutes with us, all participants, because Jeff and I would like you to be aware of what's happening with the RAND study. You heard us talk about this a year ago when we were letting people know that the RAND Employer Price Transparency Study was now open and accepting data from self-funded employers and health plans. RAND is an independent employer-led study that really, for the first time, shines a public spotlight on the prices that we're paying for healthcare services. And we held a couple webinars a year ago to encourage employers and consultants and third-party administrators in this region to participate in the RAND study, and you responded. We had one of the highest participation rates in the country. And what you're looking at right now are the results from RAND 3.0, the study that just most recently was released. And as you can see, Wisconsin, Illinois, we've got some work to do to bring our healthcare prices under control. Wisconsin came out 10th and Illinois 13th of the 46 states that were profiled in the study. And higher is not better, lower is better. So we want to be on the left side of this graph. The RAND study allows us to really raise important questions about why the prices here are higher, why there are big differences between inpatient and outpatient results, and and it drives initiatives about what we can do to bring the price down. We want to just take a second to plug this news today that RAND 4.0, the next iteration of this study, is now underway, and encourage all of you to participate. If you want to go to the next slide, Jolene, this gives you information about how you can find out more information and enroll. It is super easy to do, particularly if you are working with a national carrier that already has a data use agreement in place with RAND. You'll be hearing more from us about this. I know that we are short on time today, but I just want you to know this study is really a game changer for employers and purchasers to have information that we haven't had before, to not only create new accountability for the prices that we're paying, but also importantly, to take action. And as I said, you'll be hearing more from Jeff and I about this in the days and weeks to come. The deadline to submit data to RAND is July. So we've got some time to work on this, but wanted to take the opportunity while we had so many supporters on the phone today to let you know RAND 4.0 is underway. And with that, Jeff, I know we're going to try to sift through the questions that we got but couldn't answer in the webinar today, and do our best to get responses back out to people. And just want to thank you all for your participation today. This is such an important topic, and I think the role that employers have to play is critical, as it is in many things. We know you've all got a lot on your plates, and so thank you again for making the time for this webinar, and let's stay in touch.